Jimmy Fallon read the last line of the letter, set it face down on his desk, stood up, and walked off his own stage. Not toward the wings, not toward his dressing room. He walked to the back of the studio, past the cameras and the cables and the production monitors, past the producers standing in the dark with their headsets and their clipboards, past all of it, until he reached the wall at the very back of the room. And then he stood there with his back to 300 people and his forehead pressed against the wall and his shoulders shaking, and he did not say a single word. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody cut to commercial. The cameras kept rolling because the director in the control room understood, without needing to be told, that what was happening at the back of the studio was more important than anything that had been planned for the front of it. Questlove looked at the band. The band looked at Questlove. Nobody played. 300 people in the Tonight Show studio watched the back of Jimmy Fallon's head and waited. In the specific way that people wait when they understand that the person they are waiting for needs the moment more than they need it to end. He stood there for 47 seconds. Someone on the production team timed it afterward, not for any official reason, but because the silence needed a number to be believed. 47 seconds. In a live television studio, not one person broke it. It was a Friday evening taping. January 2024. Not a special occasion. Not a milestone episode. Not a tribute night or a season finale or any of the evenings that announce themselves in advance as important. Just a regular Friday taping of The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. The 1400 and something episode of a show that had been running for more than a decade. A normal evening and a long career. Until a producer walked onto the set during the final commercial break of the night, handed Jimmy Fallon an envelope that had arrived at the show's offices that morning, and said, "I think you should read this on air. I think it matters." Jimmy had looked at the envelope. Plain white. No return address. Postmarked Brick Township, New Jersey. His name written on the front in handwriting that was careful and slightly labored. The handwriting of someone who does not write by hand often and wanted to get this right. He had not opened it before the cameras came back up. He did not know what was in it. He had trusted his producer's judgment for 11 years, and he trusted it now, and the cameras came back from commercial, and Jimmy Fallon picked up the envelope and said to the audience, with the easy, unguarded warmth that has always been the thing that made him different from other hosts, "My producer just handed me this. She says I should read it to you, so I'm going to read it to you." He opened the envelope. He unfolded the letter inside, 2 pages, handwritten, the lines slightly uneven the way handwriting goes when the hand has been shaking slightly. He began to read aloud. He read for 4 minutes. He read until the last line. And then he set the letter face down on his desk, and he stood up. And he walked to the back of the studio without a word. And 47 seconds of silence happened in front of 300 people and 4 cameras and an audience of several million watching from home. The entire studio froze. People looked at one another, not in confusion, in the specific stillness of people who have just heard something that has moved them past the point of needing to understand it immediately. A woman in the 4th row had her hand over her heart. A man in the 2nd row was looking at the ceiling in the way people look at the ceiling when they are trying very hard not to cry in public. 300 people were unified in the particular way that only shared feeling unifies strangers, not by agreement or discussion, but by the simultaneous arrival at the same place inside themselves. Then Jimmy Fallon turned around. He walked back to his desk. He sat down. He picked up the letter. He looked at the camera, not the way he usually looks at the camera, with the performer's practiced ease, but the way a person looks at a camera when the camera has become the only way they have to reach the person they need to reach. He said, his voice barely steady, I need to find the person who wrote this." His voice broke on the next sentence. He pressed on anyway. He said, "I need them to know that I read it, that I heard it, that it's true." 300 people held their breath. And in the 9th row, a man in a gray cardigan, 62 years old, with the careful stillness of someone who had come to a television taping to be present for something and had not expected to be seen by it, pressed his hands flat on his knees and closed his eyes. To understand what that letter said, you need to understand what happened in 1992. Because Jimmy Fallon wasn't always Jimmy Fallon. Beloved host, America's late-night companion, the man who turned the Tonight Show desk into the warmest room on television. He was once just a 17-year-old boy from Saugerties, New York, who was funny in a way that frightened him slightly, because being funny had gotten him through every difficult thing so far, and he was not yet sure what happened to a person who could only do one thing, and that one thing turned out not to be enough. In the winter of 1992, Jimmy Fallon was a junior in high school, and he was performing in the school's variety show for the 3rd consecutive year. It was not a prestigious event. It was a gymnasium full of folding chairs and parents and younger siblings, and a plywood stage with a curtain that did not quite close all the way, and lighting rigs borrowed from the drama department that worked approximately 70% of the time. Jimmy had been doing impressions since he was 5 years old. He had been doing them in public since he was 12. He understood, without having words for the understanding yet, that the connection between a performer and an audience was not an abstract thing, but a physical one. That you could feel it change in a room, could feel the moment an audience moved from polite attention to genuine presence, and that chasing that feeling was the only ambition he had that felt real. The variety show that year included 23 acts. Jimmy was the closing act, not because he was recognized as the most talented student in the school, but because the drama teacher had learned over 2 years that he was the safest person to close with. Because when Jimmy Fallon was performing, the audience did not leave early. And in a school variety show at 8:30 on a Friday night in February, that was not nothing. He did 22 minutes. Impressions, original characters, a bit he had been working on for 3 months that required him to play 6 different people in rapid succession without costume changes, only his voice and his face. The gymnasium laughed. Not politely, genuinely, the way a room laughs when it is surrendered to something and stopped trying to manage how much it is enjoying itself. When he finished, the applause lasted longer than the applause for any other act, and his drama teacher gave him a nod from the wings that he has described in interviews as one of the most important nods he has ever received. In the audience that night was a man named Thomas Greer. He was 31 years old, and he had come to the variety show because his nephew was in the 4th act playing a recorder solo that had been rehearsed at high volume in the family home for 6 weeks, and because he was the kind of uncle who showed up for recorder solos and meant it. He was not involved in the entertainment industry. He was an electrician from Brick Township, New Jersey, who had driven 2 hours that Friday to be in a folding chair in a gymnasium in Saugerties for a nephew who played recorder passably, and a closing act he had no reason to anticipate. He watched Jimmy Fallon's 22 minutes, and something happened to him in the way that something happens to people when they are in the presence of a talent that is not yet famous, but is already, unmistakably, complete. Not a talent in development. Not a talented kid who might become something. Something that was already what it was going to be. Fully formed, waiting only for the world to catch up. Thomas Greer drove home to Brick Township, New Jersey, that night, and told his wife, "I saw a kid tonight who is going to be on television someday. I don't know his name, but I will know his face when I see it again." He saw the face again, 9 years later, in 2001. When Jimmy Fallon joined the cast of Saturday Night Live and his photograph appeared in a newspaper article that Thomas Greer read over breakfast on a Tuesday morning and held for a long time before putting down. He watched Saturday Night Live that weekend for the first time in years. He watched every week after that. He watched the transition to The Tonight Show in 2014 and the years that followed. The games and the interviews and the musical bits and the particular quality of joyfulness that Jimmy Fallon brought to the desk every night. A joyfulness that Thomas Greer recognized. Because he had been in the room in 1992 when it was just a 17-year-old boy in a gymnasium and a curtain that didn't close all the way, and a plywood stage, and an audience that hadn't known what it was walking into. He had thought about writing a letter many times over the years. He had dismissed the thought each time, in the way that people dismiss things they would like to do, but cannot find the correct justification for. Who was he, exactly, to write to Jimmy Fallon? He had been in the audience for a school variety show. He had not done anything. He had simply been present. The presence of a stranger in a gymnasium did not constitute a relationship. And he was not a man who overstated things. In November of 2023, Thomas Greer was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. The diagnosis was not immediately dire. His neurologist was measured and informative and careful about timelines. But it clarified certain things in the way that medical news clarifies things, by removing the ambient assumption that there will always be more time. He drove home from the neurologist's office and sat in his kitchen for an hour and thought about the things he had meant to do and the things he had meant to say, and the specific piece of unfinished business that had been sitting in the back of his mind, patient and undemanding, for 31 years. He got out a piece of paper. He got out a pen. He wrote the letter that evening at the kitchen table, in one sitting, without drafting it first, because he had been composing it in the back of his mind for 31 years, and it was, by the time he finally wrote it down, already finished. He wrote about the variety show, about the curtain that didn't close all the way, about the 22 minutes in the gymnasium full of folding chairs, and the drive home to Brick Township and what he had told his wife that night. He wrote about watching Saturday Night Live in 2001 and recognizing the face. He wrote about the years of watching after that, not as a fan exactly, but as a person who felt a particular private connection to something he had been present for before anyone else was watching. And then he wrote, in the final paragraph, the thing he had been meaning to say for 31 years. He wrote, "I do not know what your life has cost you. I do not know what it has taken out of you to do what you do every night in front of millions of people, and I do not pretend to know. But I know what I saw in that gymnasium in 1992. I saw a boy who was completely entirely himself in front of other people, and I have watched you be completely entirely yourself in front of other people for 30 years since, and I want you to know that this is the rarest thing. Most people spend their whole lives trying to be themselves and never manage it. You have done it since you were 17 years old, in a gymnasium in Saugerties, with a curtain that didn't close all the way, and an audience that had no idea what it was about to receive. I was in that audience. I have never forgotten what it felt like to be in that room. And I thought, before I run out of time to say so, that you should know." He mailed it the following morning to the Tonight Show address he found online. He did not include a return address because he was not looking for a reply. He wanted only to deliver the thing, not to make it into a transaction. Jimmy Fallon's producer received it 3 weeks later, opened it at her desk on a Thursday morning, read it twice, and then walked directly to Jimmy's office with it in her hand and did not knock. Behind the scenes, Jimmy Fallon had made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. When his producer had brought him the letter, he had read it at his desk in 3 minutes, and then sat without speaking for a long time. Then, he had asked 2 questions. First, "Is this real?" His producer said, "I had it verified. Thomas Greer of Brick Township, New Jersey. Electrician, retired, diagnosed with Parkinson's in November. All of it checks out." Second, "Can we find him?" His producer said, "We already did." Thomas Greer had been contacted by the show's outreach team the following week. He had been told, by a producer who was careful and precise and did not oversell it, that his letter had been received and read, and that the show would like, with his permission, to read it on air during a taping, and that his attendance at that taping was not required, but would be welcome if he was willing. Thomas Greer had said he would think about it. He had called back the next day and said he would come. He had been seated in the 9th row without any announcement or introduction. He was wearing a gray cardigan because it was January, and he was always cold now, one of the small indignities of the disease that he had not yet entirely made his peace with. He had a program in his lap that he had not looked at. He had arrived early and sat in his seat with his hands flat on his knees and watched the studio fill up around him with the composed patience of a man who had driven 2 hours to a school gymnasium in 1992 for a nephew's recorder's solo and was comfortable with the idea of waiting for the thing that mattered. He had watched Jimmy Fallon come out and do the monologue and conduct 2 interviews and play a game with a celebrity guest and laugh and connect and do the thing Thomas Greer had been watching him do for 30 years. And the 9-row distance between him and the desk had felt, for most of the evening, like the correct distance. Far enough to watch clearly, close enough to be present. Then, the producer had walked onto the set during the final commercial break, and Jimmy Fallon had opened the envelope. And Thomas Greer had recognized, from 9 rows back, the handwriting on the outside of the envelope as his own, and he had gone completely still. He had not moved again. Now Jimmy Fallon was back at his desk. He had the letter in his hands again. He had come back from the wall at the back of the studio and sat down, and he was looking at the camera, and his face was the face of a man who has crossed to the other side of something and is not embarrassed by what the crossing required. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. Jimmy Fallon did not try to describe what the letter had said. He did not summarize it or contextualize it or provide the audience with an organized account of what had just happened to him. He picked up the letter and he read it again, the whole thing, from the beginning, all 4 minutes of it. But this time he did not read it to the audience. He read it aloud to himself, quietly, with the letter close to his face and his voice barely above a speaking volume, the way a person reads something private that they need to inhabit rather than perform. And then he set it down a second time, and he looked directly into the camera, and he said, "I want to talk to whoever wrote this." He paused. His voice was steady now, the steadiness of a man who has moved through something and arrived somewhere quiet on the other side of it. He said, "I know you are in this building tonight. I know because my producer knows how to do her job." He paused again, and when he continued, his voice was not the voice of a television host at all. It was the voice of a person speaking to one person. He said, "The curtain really did not close all the way. I remember being so nervous about it. I remember thinking it was going to ruin everything. And then the lights came up, and the room was full of people, and none of it mattered. Because the room was full of people, and there is nothing that has ever felt as true to me as that feeling." You described it exactly right. 31 years later, you described it exactly as it felt from my side. He stopped. He looked down at the letter, then back up. He said, Would you stand up? Thomas Greer, in the 9th row, in his gray cardigan, with his hands flat on his knees, looked at Jimmy Fallon for a long moment. Then he stood up. Slowly, he did not wave. He did not perform the standing. He simply stood, the way a person stands when they are asked to and do not want to make a thing of it. Jimmy Fallon looked at him across 9 rows of people and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, his voice breaking on every word, and him not minding, and the studio not minding, and 300 people rising around Thomas Greer in the 9th row without being asked, "Thank you for being in that gymnasium. Thank you for coming tonight. Thank you for writing it down before you ran out of time." Thomas Greer nodded once. He sat back down. He folded his hands in his lap. The applause was enormous and immediate and entirely involuntary. The kind that does not begin as a decision but arrives as a reflex, the body's understanding preceding the mind's. 300 people on their feet for a man in a gray cardigan in the 9th row who had driven 2 hours to a school gymnasium 31 years ago for a nephew's recorder solo, and had ended up carrying something much larger than he had intended, and had carried it faithfully for 3 decades, and had found, finally, the right place to set it down. Jimmy Fallon stood at his desk and looked at Thomas Greer, and the tears were still on his face, and he let them be there, and he did not apologize for them, and he did not explain them. Because the people in that room had read the same letter he had read, and they did not need the tears explained. Thomas Greer drove home to Brick Township, New Jersey, after the taping. His wife met him at the door. He told her the whole story over dinner, in the unhurried way of a man who has gotten used to taking things at the pace they require. She listened, without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "You always said you would know his face when you saw it again." He said, "I did know it. The first time I saw it on television, I knew it immediately." She said, "And did he know yours?" He thought about this. Then he said, "He did tonight." Jimmy Fallon framed the letter the following week. It hangs in his dressing room at 30 Rockefeller Plaza, to the left of the mirror, at eye level, the place where he will see it every evening before he goes out to do the thing he has been doing since he was 17 years old, in a gymnasium in Saugerties, with a curtain that did not close all the way. Thomas Greer's Parkinson's has progressed slowly, as his neurologist predicted it might. He still drives, though less than before. He still watches The Tonight Show most Fridays, in his chair by the window, with his wife in the chair beside him. He does not think of himself as someone who did something significant. He thinks of himself as someone who was in the right place, at the right time, paying attention. His nephew, now 42, still plays recorder occasionally, at family gatherings, when the conditions are right and the audience is forgiving. He is, by his own admission, still only passable. Nobody minds. The audience that changes a life is never the large one. It is always the one that was paying attention on the night before anyone knew there was something to pay attention to.